Welcome everyone. For those who aren't familiar, my name's Darren Clear. This is Jody Warren. We're both part of the Gentia executive team, and we've been having we've been doing a lot of work in the last few months about the respect at work recommendations that cover mainly sexual harassment, sex-based harassment in the workplace, amongst some other things. And we normally have these sort of workshop discussions, and we thought, why not we just jump online, have one together, and we can share our thinking, share some of the work that we've been doing as we're working on the Gentia platform here. We're also working on some audits that we're getting people to do, and just helping from a consultancy and training point of view some of our clients in being able to achieve compliance with the respect at work recommendations. But Jody, I'll bring you in straight away, because this is sort of how we came across this conversation. Why does respect at work matter now, and what sort of changes have we seen in this area that make it really should be at the forefront of most organisations' minds?
Look, I think it's always mattered. I think it's now, well, since December 2022, it's come into the legal sort of framework of what organisations have to do. But I think we know, Darren, from our work in leading well and coaching and training leaders, that there are a set of behaviours that basically, when they are present in the workplace, they cause people to, burn out, disengage, and they're basically affecting people's performance. And they're known as the toxic five. They're behaviors that MIT Institute uncovered in some research they did on trying to understand burnout in the workplace. And the toxic five are disrespectful, non-inclusive, cutthroat, bullying, unethical. So if you apply that to respect at work, respect being the key area, of course, inclusion comes in. It's really affecting performance. And oftentimes what we see is the behaviors creep in because the workplace, unfortunately, is heavily optimized towards productivity, profitability. But the irony is that when we're only focused on those things, we happen to sort of then tap into the areas of disrespect and some of the things that we see come up in the positive duty, where we see poor behaviors creeping in, and oftentimes they're sort of faded into the background because we're too focused on the profitability, productivity side of things, and it's hurting that anyway. So and as I said, it's now a positive duty and a legal obligation. So since December
Well, that's the
2022.
thing I was going to jump in and say. Like, where it's changed from my point of view was it was kind of nice to have, if you like, when we sort of started this, and there was a lot of work around compliance and making sure that you tick the boxes. It's now an expectation, right? So the AHRC, they have teeth now. They can come in and investigate without a complaint being made. The expectation is there that you have a positive duty. And what does positive duty mean? And in some senses, it is a legal term, but it's also it is what it says it is, right? You're expected to be on the front foot. Okay, you can't just, so they're going to come in and investigate your culture. They're going to say, what are you doing on a consistent basis within this workplace? What sort of things do you have in place in that? And it's not just a box ticking exercise anymore, is it?
No, exactly. So there's elements, of course, you've got to understand what's legally required. You've got to have that evident in your, compliance documentation. You've got to be able to evidence it. So, it's not good enough to say, yes, I did some training last year, but I have absolutely no record of it. You've got to be recording it. And the bigger piece is it's got to be part of your culture. So, and we've seen this before. It's in the policy. We've got best practice all documented. And yet when you go and see what happens every day, it's not actually being put into place. Flexible working would be something people would have seen, and that's not part of this, but it's that we've got the policy, yet when I try to leave early, I get the side glances. I'm being, disadvantaged, overlooked for promotion. So, you know, culture is that emotional blueprint that is like, what do people do on a day-to-day basis? So it's not a one-off. It's like, what's the norm when it comes to how people are promoted? What happens if somebody makes an inappropriate comment? What happens if somebody, you know, makes a report? How are they treated? Like, all of those norms form your culture. And if you don't have your culture right, your compliance isn't going to save you. So not to suggest that you don't need the compliance paperwork side of things in place, but your culture has to support it. And that's the harder stuff.
Yeah, the phrase I keep coming back to is people like us do things like this. Okay, so that's where it becomes about culture. It's about a shared identity and behaviours, not rules. So your culture is created by trillion tiny acts, right? And we've seen this. We've been doing this for about 15 years at this point. And you and I can go into a business space and we can describe the culture, and then we're almost finishing each other's sentences because we've seen it before. We've seen these cultural problems before. You know, things like if a high performer makes inappropriate comments and nothing happens, that's your culture. If someone reports harassment and their colleagues start treating them differently, that comes down to your culture. That's not a matter of policy. The policies generally will be in the right place and you'll be saying the right things from a policy point of view. What's actually happening on the ground? What's actually happening when you dig into these situations that happen? How do you have data? This is the big thing, and we're going to dig into this today. Where are you getting your data from? Is it quality data? How do you respond to that data? Right, because we're taking this from a reactive approach to a proactive approach. And the first step of that is to really understand your landscape of your business. So because your culture connects to everything that the organisation want to do, right? So for example, innovation requires psychological safety. People need to feel safe to experiment and fail. So if they've learned that speaking up is risky, they won't do it. So you'll be halfway through implementing a really important change, and people will be seeing risks and problems all over the place. They won't bring it up because you haven't got that speak up culture in place. That's where again, and you can't write a policy to say you've got to speak up. Or
Well,
well, you
you've
can
heard it
write it.
before, culture eats strategy for breakfast, and it's every time. Like, you can document it, you can have the absolute gold standard in writing, but it is in writing and it's got to be happening. And that means, and there's a process. So, you know, you still have it in writing, but it's got to be operationalized. So it's not, you know, we don't just have the poster on the wall. It's the behavior that we see and we experience regularly. So it's not a one-off, it's what's typically happening. And that's the key sort of part of it that is harder to achieve because it's sort of less, you have less control. So you kind of, yes, you can influence it and you definitely can listen to it and measure it and have consequences and improve it. And there's a sort of process. And I think the positive duty framework does give you a really clear pathway as to how to do that. So there's 7 pillars, and that's what I think we can sort of walk people through now is what do they look like, and you know, where do we see people go wrong, and what do we need to be looking out for and measuring, and how do we approach it so that we are meeting our obligations.
That's right. So if the AHRC are going to come in tomorrow and you know, do a compliance audit on your business, on your organisation, these are the 7 pillars that you're going to be looking at. So obviously you need to be looking at them yourself and understand exactly where you're at in each of these 7 areas. So that's what we're going to do now, is run you through each of the 7 pillars. And then we'll sort of talk a little bit about what Gentia is doing to help businesses meet these different areas and understand where you're at and really get that landscape picture of where you're at in terms of your respective work compliance audit that you may want to do yourself. So the first pillar is leadership and governance, right? Now, this is where most organisations underestimate, I think, what's required, and we've seen that ourselves, Jody, over the years, which you know. So it's not just enough, for example, for the board to be vaguely aware of the positive duty. They need to understand what it requires, receive regular reports on prevention, not just incidents, and this should be a standing board agenda item, right, at least quarterly. And if you don't, you're not a big enough organisation necessarily have a board, it needs to be a standing management meeting agenda item. Because, as you know, it's all about accountability, isn't it?
Well, exactly. I mean, if your board and your executive team aren't engaged, everything else you do is window dressing. It's like, we know this, again, going back to leading well, we have one of the RISE principles is ethics. So we have a discussion around, moral muteness. And I know we have an exercise where we give people a scenario that involves, people of authority, senior people, and it's like, here's a scenario, I'm going to paint this picture, and these people are going to be engaging in inappropriate behavior. What do you do when you're much more junior? And you and I have both sat in, hundreds of those leading well sessions, and very few people, when they're honest, will put their hand up and say, I would speak out in that situation. There's a few, but often it's, oh, hang on a minute, like the scenario is it's my bosses and it's the CEO and it's senior people and nobody really spoke up and a couple of people laughed, and where do I stand? And what we know, moral muteness thrives when your status is lower. It thrives when it's coming from above. And so leadership and governance is exactly where you have to start. And, you've got to take it seriously. You've got to know that the board understands the positive duty. They receive regular reports on sexual harassment prevention, not just incident numbers when something goes wrong, but what you're proactively doing to prevent harm. Your senior leaders need to be held accountable. It needs to be part of their KPIs. It needs to be a standing agenda on board and senior meetings, like not once a year, quarterly, like standard, a standing agenda. You need to have allocated resources. Like if you say you're serious, fund it like you're serious. What are you spending on it? What are you allocating to it? Are these senior leaders role modeling the appropriate behaviours themselves? Do they speak up? Do they treat people with respect in every interaction? Like everything that you do flows from that. And going back to culture, your culture's really set there in a lot of ways. You'll get little micro cultures pop up in organizations, but you've got to have those clear structures, and then you do need to be thinking about the evidence. So remembering that, when it is part of a regular board meeting, make sure you've got the minutes and the records of that, so that, because when the Australian Human Rights Commission come in to do an audit, that's what they're going to ask for.
Yeah, and you can tell a lot about an organisation's culture by looking at two things I've found over the years: organisational structure and related KPIs within that. And then you get into sort of governance structures as well, when you're looking at some of the respective work compliance areas that you need to meet. So to make sure that these things are built in to the organisational structure as you go down an organisation, but also into the KPIs of everyone, and we're all moving in the same direction and we all have the same expectations. And now that may not be the same things that you're doing within those expectations, but as an organisation, we have an expectation that the sexual harassment preferably doesn't exist within our workplace, but where it does, it's able to be called out, and we're able to be actionable when it is called out sexual harassment or sex-based harassment. So just to tie that bow, and you've already sort of talked about it, so the evidence the AHRC would want to see: board minutes showing regular discussions, executive KPIs, budget allocations, governance structures. These are the sort of things you can do. Now, you can sit there and go, treat that as a box ticking exercise, right? But if you haven't got that cultural buy-in behind that, it's not going to stick, right? And very quickly these things are going to fall apart, and you're going to get to a minutes of a meeting and say, this wasn't discussed this time, and it's going to fall by the wayside. So it has to start with culture before you sort of look at compliance. And I think so often we've sort of looked at the compliance side and been hyper focused on that, and we've lost sight of what the actual cultural side is. One of the areas, if we're looking at that sort of top-down approach to sort of move on to cover, and we might cover pillars 2, 3, and 4 in this sort of same area here, Jody, where we want to look at policies, risk assessment, and training, right? Your policies, risk assessment, and training, particularly your training, has got to be from a top-down approach. But I think when we talk about policies, I think most organisations would assume our policies are fine in this area because the focus has been so much on compliance over the years. But most organisations have the policies. They say the right things. They know what they need to do. The question is not whether you have the policy, right? It's, do you have the policy in place, in the sense that, is it comprehensive? Is it accessible? Is it actually used? So what do you think what would you say comprehensive means in practice?
Well, you'd want to clearly define sexual harassment. Is it aligned to Section 28A of the Sexual Discrimination Act? Does it cover sex-based harassment, which is, harassment based on gender that isn't sexual in nature? Does it define victimization? So, the retaliation that happens. Does it cover all the context of where harassment might happen? So online, third party, from clients and customers, at work events. Does it provide multiple reporting pathways? So you don't want to tell your manager, that would be ridiculous, but that can and does happen. You want multiple reporting pathways. You want to know whether the documented investigation process is trauma informed. So what does it say happens in that process? Is the policy reviewed annually? And is someone keeping up to date with legislative changes? And critically, is it communicated to everybody? Okay, because oftentimes someone's written an amazing policy that's got all of that in it, but then you go to the workforce and the staff themselves and they'll say, I think we've got something, it might be on the intranet, they haven't seen it, they don't know about it. And then, remembering that a lot of workplaces are going to have contractors and casuals, and they need to know it exists and what's in it as well. And again, then you've got to have that evidence. So when your contractors come in, when did they get shown that policy, and have you recorded that? Because they're the sorts of things that you have to be doing so that, the intention is also being recorded.
Yeah, to me, I would have some process maps behind those policies as well. So, because that's a visual thing that people can look at and say, how's this work? Right, we've got our multiple reporting pathways in place. Who's actually going to be responsible for investigating this? The trauma-informed investigation procedures, etc. That comes obviously through your training, so you can obviously make sure that's within the policy. You've got to make sure people are trained in that way, but also just to sort of tie the bow on that, the process mapping side of it, it's crucial too for someone that is going through the process to be able to look at something and say, this is point A, I want to get to point B, what steps am I taking? Not just,
yes,
I need to now report this and then go, I don't know what's happening now. And
that's
can add to
exactly,
the
that's a
anxiety.
good point, because you could have a policy that, you know, covers everything completely comprehensively, but if it can't be interpreted correctly by everybody that needs to interpret it, so, depending on what stakeholder and who's needing to pick it up and understand it, you'll need to deal with that. So that's where things like those mapping processes can make it, easy for people to interpret.
Yeah, well, as you know, Jay, I'm an old business analyst, so I'll go into Visio and just be making all sorts of process maps. I'm sure AI now would be so far ahead of the game on that sort of stuff. You could even put your policy into an AI engine and see some process maps
Well,
come
we've
out.
actually done some work in Gentia where now we're really excited with our Insight Navigator tool that we've just deployed, and it's able to take policies and interpret them with a chat so that, you know, people can say, hey, build me a process map for this, and can you answer this? I'm not understanding it. So that's sort of where we're heading with all this stuff.
Yes, exactly. So, and that's where you're really making sure that people are informed when they're going to do it. And it's not just around policy, of course, it's also around your risk assessments, right? So what we know is most organisations haven't done a proper risk assessment for sexual harassment. So one of the things that's been surprising for me going through this, I kind of thought, and we'll talk about the audit at the very end, but just to bring it up now, my sort of thinking going into this was, I thought most organisations, when they did this audit, would come out with a, I don't know, 75, 80% score. The scores we're seeing are below 50% more often than not. And I think one of the areas that people are, or that the organisations are falling down on, is just saying we haven't done a proper risk assessment. There may have been one done by, you know, the person in the role previously or years ago, but if they have been done, haven't been documented properly, and they certainly haven't been done. I think they need to be done, obviously, periodically, and that needs to go into policy. So that goes into our previous our previous pillar, talking about policies. When do your risk assessments get done? It's not good enough to go and do a risk assessment. You know, I mean, just totally separate to this. I mean, I was just talking earlier this morning to someone involved in our local football club, and within the last year, they've doubled their female players and coaches. So they now need to do a new risk assessment around this sort of stuff, and that's just obviously within a, you know, within the context of a reasonably small community sporting club. So they're the sort of things that you just, you know, it's easy to go by the wayside if you don't have these policies and the expectations in place that you're going to do that.
Well, there's constant change. So that is where, again, we'll get to the final pillar where you're going on this sort of, you know, constant improvement process. But a lot of these risks, you do your risk assessment, and you might say, in the case that you just brought up, we're pretty much a mostly male football club, so, you know, gender imbalance isn't something that we have to think of as a risk. Well, guess what? Now you do. Someone hasn't sort of got a periodic, let's revisit the risk assessment, then how do we know that's happening? And really, ideally, it would be really, you know, great if something actually flagged it and said, hey, I think you need to revisit this because I see this risk. And that's kind of where we're heading with all this AI and predictive, and looking at how can we better support people that are in charge of this so that they've got that always on companion. But, you know, thinking about the risks, there are sort of major ones that you need to be looking at, and they are, you've got power imbalances. So a lot of organizations, just by the sheer nature of the way the work is organized and the hierarchical nature of how different roles sit, there is sort of areas where there's real power imbalances in different pockets. There's gender imbalances, so that would be another risk that you'd want to look at. So male dominated areas, absence of women in leadership. You've got client and customer interaction, so that's another risky area that you've got to look at. And maybe it's an organization where there's very much the customer's always right. How does that look if the customer's the one that's the perpetrator? You know, some businesses operate with alcohol, so that's another thing to think about. Isolated remote kind of work, so maybe I'm on a trip with a couple of colleagues, the fly in, fly out arrangements, those kind of things are areas you want to think about. They add another element of risk. High pressure work environments are another one. So, you know, if you've got really long hours, competitive workplaces, that work hard, play hard sort of culture can create environments where things can be overlooked. So we want to make sure that we're understanding that's a risk, and that look out for things like ethical fading. And again, when you this is a risk assessment process, which means when you see the risk, you want to map the controls to the risk. Poor culture, as we touched on. And a big one, Darren, that you and I have discussed, which, you know, controversial or not, I would ban it, but it is alcohol availability. I think that's just, to me, when you see the really, really serious cases, quite often alcohol's involved, and it's just something I feel like doesn't need to be in a workplace context. And I like a wine as much as the next person, but having it at work is something you want to really think hard about. And if you do, understand it's a very high risk.
Yeah, and I think the final point I'll make around the risk assessment and any register you have, it's got to be a live document, right? It's not going to be just this static document. Oh, we put that together. That's that box ticked. Again, we're going into that box ticking thinking. We might revisit that in 5 years or something. No, you've got to revisit it. And as you're getting data in, right? So don't build it off anecdotes, build it off hard data. So doing your surveys, doing some focus groups, doing some turnover data, look at your exited groups, consultation with diverse groups within your organisation. These are the ways you build your risk register, not just by getting in the room and saying, all right, share out some risks and we'll write them down. And as I said, a lot of that comes from anecdotes, and some of the building will come from those sort of storytelling, etc. But the more data that you can put towards this, and again, links back to pillar 2 in your policies, right? We make sure that we get our policies around not only how often the risk register is updated, but sort of what we expect to be put into it. Where are we getting our data from? How is that data? Because then the policies around how you do your staff surveys directly feeds into you making sure that your sex-based harassment and sexual harassment policies are correct, right? Now we're talking a bit more culture, right? Because we're feeding different things in and we're understanding when we're putting a staff survey together, these are the areas that we want to focus on because that's our priorities as an organisation. The other part, and we've sort of mentioned this already, another key part of this area in pillar 4 is around training, right? So, and I want to sort of put it to you that, and we've sort of seen this, haven't we, over the years, where we come in and do training ourselves, and we've seen other training, not to throw anyone else under the bus, but poor training can do more harm than good, can't it?
Oh yeah, I mean, it can't be a box tick, because you can't approach training as this goes back to culture versus compliance. If I'm training for compliance, I'm ticking the box and I'm measuring, how many people completed it. If I'm training for culture, I want to change behavior. I want people to learn something. I want them to take it on board. I've got to put it into context. It's got to mean something. I've got to understand what is in it for the person involved as well. So, you've got to remember, especially if you've got some problems, people may come into it a bit cynical, a bit sort of with a preconceived idea, or, is this going to be some woke kind of HR thing that you're going to tell me I can't make a joke in the workplace? And so you've really got to get under the covers and sort of give people scenarios and let them really build their empathy muscles to sort of understand why this is important. And it does tie to productivity and to better outcomes at work, and that's when you can start to bring people on and make it effective. So that's going to involve measuring success. So pre and post assessments are a good way to do that. Are people actually learning something? How are you measuring the behavior change? And we're really big on that with all the training that we do. I'm not really interested if you liked it. I would prefer that you've made changes off the back of it. So, treat it like a business case, and a business case is a business. So what is the change we're seeking to make? Who's it for? What's it for? So first of all, you'd have a who's it for? It's for all workers need a foundational training. So everybody across the organisation should have some sort of understanding of the legal definition of sexual harassment, workplace specific examples, where's your policy found, multiple reporting pathways, what do they look like, and by every employee, going back to what I said before, it's got to be contractors, casuals, like everybody has that training. and make sure you've got it recorded somewhere, because you're going to be asked potentially to evidence it. Then you're going to look at your managers and supervisors. So they need an enhanced level of training. So you've got very specific training geared to them. So, you know, they'll have additional responsibilities around how to recognise warning signs, how to respond to disclosures in a trauma-informed way, when to escalate versus when to handle informally, how to support affected workers, etc. So you've got to actually think about what that training looks like. And again, how are you measuring the success of that training? You're going to use scenarios, role play, that sort of things effective. Then you're going to give your board members and executives special training, because again, they've got a different role to play. So they'll need to understand their governance responsibilities, what the positive duty actually requires of them in their role. And finally, you do need your HR, and your investigators will need specialist training. So it's not good enough to throw someone in HR under the bus and say, we've got someone that's made a report, you need to go and actually investigate it. They'll need training in how to do that in a trauma-informed way, because there's obviously very specialised ways to make sure that you're, you know, covering procedural fairness. You understand how to not re-traumatize the person that's bringing this information to you, and all of that sort of stuff requires really specialist training.
Yeah, and you put that the trauma-informed is acknowledged within the policy, right? It's acknowledged within your risk register, and it's also then delivered within the training, right? So we're now getting that through line. You know, the analogy I use is about learning how to drive a car, right? You can go and just do your 120 hours driving around the local netball court and doing your reverse park and things like that. You might learn enough just doing that to pass your driving test. It's not going to make you a good driver, right? You're just making sure that you're ticking off those things along the way. What you want to do, and this is where we come from, that growth mindset sort of thinking, is any training that you do, you want to say, what do we want to have at the end of this? Where do we want to grow? Where's our growth mindset sort of coming in? And that's where, and it can be different across each section of the organisation, but everyone, again, is sort of doing that same level of training as a base level, and then you expand on that as you need to for more specialist knowledge, because not everyone needs to be trained in the trauma-informed investigations, obviously, but you need to make sure that the people that are conducting these investigations and are receiving these complaints are able to do that.
Well, and I think you and I know as well, Darren, that sometimes the more uncomfortable the training is, and the more we're willing to acknowledge where we don't get it right, and where, you know, the sort of blind spots exist and what we've seen, the more we learn. Because, you know, if we keep it all, oh, you know, in the nice sort of easy boxes, it's not, the learning happens when you say, I think I've got that wrong. You know, when someone's willing to put up their hand and say, I should have spoken up, or I've seen this before and this created it, that's where people can start to get more learning. And then look, moving on, that kind of leads us into the pillar 5, the reporting and response. So I really think this is where the rubber meets the road when something goes wrong, isn't it?
Well, even if you have all your positive duty stuff in place and you feel like, yep, we're being as proactive as we can be, and you're happy with that, you still, there's still going to be areas where something's going to go wrong, and you need to look at really review your reporting response. Now, we've covered a couple of these already. Let's make sure we have multiple pathways of reporting, right? Let's make sure people understand the process. They may not understand it before it happens to them, but once they start going down that reporting pathway, it's very easy for them to understand this is what the process is, right? Your multiple pathways, for example, are going to be your manager, HR, external hotline, maybe even an anonymous option, right? To make sure that it's going to the person that they're going to feel most comfortable with and is also trained in this area. Because the most common reason people don't report is because they don't trust the process, okay? And if you don't know the process, how can you trust the process? So it's not just a matter of, okay, well, I reported that to Jody, now I'll just sit back and hope that Jody gets back to me.
Well, and critically, the Australian Human Rights Commission expects that to happen within 48 hours. So that's a requirement. And again, you need to be recording that. So it's no good to say, yes, we did, and that be guesswork. That's where you've got to be really diligent in following the policies, which will have said, if you've got your policy right, it's got to be 48 hours and you've got to document it.
Yes. And the other part around, and again, we're sort of, it's interesting as we go along in the pillars we cover, we come back and sort of see some of the commonalities. Another commonality: investigations need to be trauma informed. Okay, so, and that comes around, your language is obviously a big part of that, and how you do that, and it's also about how it's recorded, so the AHRC can look at both of those and understand, you've been delivered the correct training. The person that's looking into this has the correct training around this, and the language that they're using in any reporting is correct in that way. And then you can assume that the questions that are being asked and the way that they're going about it's coming from a trauma-informed place as well.
Well, and it does go back to that training, doesn't it? And, when someone understands that they're prioritising safety and transparency and choice and empowerment, and have an understanding.
We're telling the story once. We're not telling the story 5 times.
That's exactly
where we're following
right.
our process map.
And the trauma affects memory and behaviour. So you'd understand that. You'd understand that, you're not trying to re-traumatize someone. Your investigations are, based on the person conducting them's qualified. That's important.
Yes, and when you move through that process, so the complaint's been made, we've had the response, qualified investigators have come forward that have the right specialist training to move through that. When the harassment is substantiated, we need to make sure that there's consequences to that, and the consequences are in line with what your policies and procedures are around that there's appropriate support offered, and there's systemic improvement. So it's not just a matter of saying, well, that person was a bad apple. It's like, no, now we're going to dig back into our culture, and we're going to look at some of the systemic pressures that may be in place, some of the areas some of the risks. We're going to revisit our risk register now. That's a live document. We're going to go back to that after we go through this process. And again, all these things are going to be documented, right? That we go back and we look at these things to make sure that we're actively monitoring for retaliation, for example, as well, right? So, because this is where the victimisation part of it comes in. We mentioned that earlier with our policy writing. Okay, so if their work life gets harder after they speak up, that's victimisation, right? And it's actually illegal under the AHRC. So that brings us actually nicely back around to where we started, and that's the culture pillar, right? And this is where the real work needs to happen, because you can have the best policy, you can train everyone, you can have your robust complaint procedures, but if the culture doesn't support respect, the harassment will continue.
Yeah, and that is the harder work. That is where, you need to be thinking about how you measure culture. Like, you've really got to dig into, okay, if cultures, people like us do things like this, it's the unwritten rules, it's the shared assumptions, it's the normalized behavior regardless of what the policies say. How are you seeing that?
It dictates whether people feel safe reporting. It dictates whether bystanders intervene, dictates whether complaints are taken seriously or quietly buried, and it dictates whether harassers face consequences or get promoted anyway. These are the things, and that's things that can be investigated by the AHRC.
Yes.
You've got someone that had a complaint against them. It wasn't, yes, you've gone through the processes. There was no consequences at the end. They got a promotion.
And I think it's also important to note that, again, your culture could support it's got to be a fair process, a transparent process, because the person who's having the complaint made against them also deserves a fair process. You don't want to have the culture that also maybe jumps to conclusions and doesn't follow the policy and works through in a very clear, fair and transparent way. So because, everybody deserves that fair process, and your policy has to, your culture rather, has to support what you say you do. So you've documented all of that and you've followed that correct procedure, and everybody's had the right training, and we've got all of that in place. Now, what are the normal behaviors? And you need to know what they look like. You need to understand, and they can exist in pockets too, don't forget. So you can have a whole organization and there's one section, and we've seen this, haven't we, Darren? Like, people have even made core values of their own up in certain little areas of the business and use those to their advantage to bully and intimidate, and it hasn't been happening across the whole business, but it happens in pockets. So you've got to be thinking about ways that you actually are listening and measuring that culture, which is going to come back to validated surveys, focus groups, talking to your managers and leaders, 360 assessments. Like, there's lots of ways that you can actually assess your culture regularly.
Well, there is. I mean, this is where, because your culture's a living organism, if you like, within your business. It's always changing, and you can have little changes here and there that you might even do it with the best of intentions, and it can have impacts that you're not even aware of if you're not consistently collecting that data, consistently asking the questions that you need to ask. This is where I get excited about the work that Gentia is doing in this space, because we're allowing the organisations that we work with to sort of have that dashboard system, if you like, that they're able to track these things in real time. Okay, and you're able to be proactive and say, hang on, this is a little bit out of the norm now. This is something that needs to be flagged, and it's not it's not going to be flagged when it's red. It's going to be flagged when it's just sort of moves to amber, if you like, if you think about that traffic light system, and then we're going to be able to be proactive, dig into why is it. Like we've had things like an organisation changes some of the values, changes the wording of some of the values that they had. I think, what was it? Was one thrive or something? I can't remember the exact word that they used, Jay, but it was sort of inadvertently leading to burnout within the organisation because people
I think it was flex. I think it was someone
flex,
had added,
right.
we are flexible, and it was kind of like, then it was being pushed to like, well, come on, you need to flex, and it was kind of like, I'm actually about to break. So yeah. I think, interestingly though, prior to this AI and being able to be so proactive to the point that we can even now be predictive, one of the things that we've probably had to do is get people to think differently about the dashboard, because traditionally, to me, the dashboard was the rear view mirror, wasn't it? It was a bit like, by the time I've put everything in it and I've got what I need to get, it's showing me what's behind me. And now it's in real time, which is where it is exciting and completely different. It's almost like maybe we need a different word or something, just so that people aren't thinking about it in the same typical.
Well, I use it, as you know, I've done some work in the mining sector, so I think about in the toolbox meetings and the physical safety, which has been obviously a big part of the mining sector, and that is measured in these sort of dashboards. But it's very much more predictive now than what it was. When I first worked with them 15 years ago. It's much more predictive now. They're much more proactive about these things, and we need to get in the same space around psychological safety, which obviously we're seeing, and also around and I mean, this respect at work. These recommendations feed directly into that sort of psychological safety, because when psychological safety is low, harassment thrives in the silence, right? And if you're not really measuring your culture regularly, you're guessing at it, right? And guessing isn't a proper compliance strategy, and you're going to get found out, particularly if the AHRC come in, either to investigate a complaint or just sort of see how you're tracking along these things, because they can come in, as we've mentioned, without an official complaint being made now. That brings us to our final point, I think it leads us nicely actually into our final pillar of monitoring and and the continuous challenge. Okay, so continuous improvement obviously has been the big part of my working life as a business analyst, but monitoring is just as important as that, knowing where you need to improve, because compliance isn't a destination necessarily, it's a continuous loop. Okay, so most organisations will do the audit, they'll identify the gaps, they'll create an action plan, then sits in the drawer, everyone goes back to their jobs, right? Because it's not, there's not that sort of follow through. And how often have we seen it, Jay? We pick out these reports and we go, gee, that's actually a really well written report and there's some good recommendations here. Why weren't they acted upon? And it wasn't. It's sometimes as simple as it wasn't given to anyone to actually do. It was just sitting there and waiting for someone to pick it up. So it's important to note here the AHRC expects comprehensive data collection, right? So that's talking about prevalence, the reporting, the risk factors, culture, training, what prevention activities you're doing, right? Regular analysis, at least quarterly, to identify the trends, and leadership receiving those regular reports. Again, is it the board meeting agenda item? Is it a senior management meeting agenda item, depending on the size of your organisation? So the critical question then becomes, how are you using your data? Because one thing to get data, and we've been in that, haven't we, as well, where we've seen organisations that are fantastic at collecting data, and you go, wow, we've learnt things off them about how they've collected data, but they're not using it for anything. It just sort of
Well,
sits
data
there.
without action's just paperwork, isn't it? I mean, you know, I'm on paper, I've got it all right, but it's the point is to learn from it, to identify what's working and what's not, to catch emerging risks, to, you know, that's the continuous loop. And every workplace, I don't care who you are, you're going through just continuous change now is the normal. Like, it's not a used to be a change we'd go through and manage. It's just constant, which means you've got to be constantly on this improvement loop, because you will not go, I've got my compliance done and set, because tomorrow is another day and something else has come in that I didn't know created another risk, or another person moved in and left, and you know, that just creates this need even more so for constant improvement.
Well, and I've seen the same thing. It's going back to that mining sector analogy where, you know, they were very good at reporting the incidents, very good at collecting data on incidents, not very good at actually making improvements off the back of what those incidents were. Now you won't have, if there's a safety incident on the mine site, you can guarantee there'll be a process change. It might be very minor, it might be a different checklist, you know, a different spot put on the checklist. I love checklists, as you know, but there might be little things like that they're going to do, but they're going to be some sort of a proactive response and a post incident review, right, as part of your post incident review. They're going to identify systemic issues, implement improvements. They're not just going to close the file and move on. We need to have the same view on sex-based harassment or sexual harassment incidents within the workplace, right? And we do that because it's now the expectation, right? So we
Yeah.
really need to make sure that we do it.
And I
Because
think, Darren, it's also important to point out that, you know, if people see the improvements, then that feeds back into, like, I don't feel like speaking up isn't worthwhile. I see the point of speaking up. I see the point of calling this out, because stuff gets done as well. So I think that's important, that not only are you on a continuous improvement loop, you're communicating that back to people. Like, that is really important, because to build psychological safety doesn't just happen because I go and say I want it to happen. You've got to make it feel like it's tied to the work, it's tied to the purpose of what we do, and that, you know, not only do I know it's okay to speak out and say that's not okay, I feel compelled to, because I know something's going to happen.
yeah, well, let's finish, because we've given people a lot to think about with the 7 pillars, and it is a comprehensive report, the respect at work report. the recommendations, 55 recommendations that you need, and basically 55 questions you need to ask of your organisation. So it is quite a big undertaking if you're going to sit there and say, look, we're going to do this review. Paint us a picture of of the work that we're sort of doing within Gentia, and maybe steps people can take to connect with us to help them in that journey.
Yeah, so we, having been consultants that have done this for a long time, we understand the process. And fortunately, we also have technology people that work for us. So we're at the intersection of, we are subject matter experts in this, but we also have people that are actual engineers. So they understand how to, set up AI to do this. It's not a small undertaking, so it's not something that you'd go and get a lot of success with, say, ChatGPT or others, because as you know, Darren, we do a huge amount of work before we get into the final product of expert data labeling, cleaning that data, lots of evaluations and training and fine tuning and all that sort of stuff, and ontologies. And like, there's a lot of stuff, because when you understand AI and how it works, a lot of this stuff is really, really good at English language, but the training it's had is Reddit threads and
It's good at
YouTube
telling you you're
videos.
doing a great job.
Yes,
And
very,
sometimes
very good.
you
So,
need.
and because it's so good at the English language, it can be very compelling at that. So you believe it. And so without that rigorous testing, it's really, be very, very careful, is what I would say, using the large language models. They can be good for things, but just be careful on what you're relying on. But paint a picture of what we've used and created and built. Imagine that, you've got a system that's going to map your controls around the legislation. It's going to identify what's missing, keep your documentation consistent as your systems evolve. Your risk registers are updated automatically as new data emerges. It's going to, pick up your gaps, give you roadmaps, build assessments, deliver assessments, analyze assessments, like all of the administrative tasks that tend to be the burden on the individuals that are responsible and own this space, now can be freed up to say, I've got this kind of 24/7, always on, reliable assistant that does all of that for me, so I can then go and do much higher value work, which is all of that culture stuff. So Gentia still helps with that, but it does empower the individuals to go and, talk to people, sit in those focus groups, like all the stuff that usually is the wish list, because I can't ignore the paperwork side of it and the documentation. Now we're empowering those people to actually go and do that. So, that is proactive compliance, and it gets to the point that we would even call it predictive excellence, when you really get the system humming, because you can start to model restructures and change projects in the system to see what you need to be looking at before it's actually even happened. So, that excites me. And we've done this with, as you know, psychosocial risks, so a lot of the legislation around that. And we've moved into this respect at work framework, because it's another key critical area for businesses.
And the good thing is that we have built within our work around respect at work, we've built an audit tool that aligns to the AHRC framework, covers all 7 pillars. It asks the hard questions. It's free to use, no credit card, no sales call. You just get and at the end of that, you get a gap analysis. You get a roadmap report, you prioritise recommendations within that, and benchmarking for within your industry. So that is a really, really valuable tool, as well as the Insight Navigator, which you reference. And the good thing about the AI, when I think about AI, I get a little bit nervous, because I like the analogy, Jody, of the wild horse that can just go off in too many different tangents. Ours it's probably not the best description to say it's a closed system, but it is to the extent where it's going to be hyper focused on, particularly this audit and this Insight Navigator, hyper focused on that AHRC framework and where your gaps are and what sort of things that you need to do to make sure that you are compliant within that audit. So that's where it's the value really does come in, doesn't it?
Yeah, exactly. So look, if anyone's interested, we'll put some notes in the comments and the overview of this podcast on how to access that audit. And yeah, reach out and we'll set you up with a login. It's pretty easy to get started, and it gives you the ability to test drive. If you want to keep going manually, there's no pressure. You can. You've got a roadmap to take away, but it gives you a feel for what sort of AI can do when it's been purpose built in the way that we've done this.
Yeah, and look, and keep following us and keep watching this. Make any comments that you think about how helpful this has been. That these are the sort of chats that we want to continue to have, to sort of let people a bit of a peek behind the scenes about some of the exciting things that we're doing here at Gentia. But thanks, Jody, for your time this morning, and I'm sure there's plenty of other things that we can get on with for the rest of our day.
Yes, no, thanks, Darren.
All right. I don't know how long that was.